Good evening and welcome. My name is Allison Green, Manager of External Exhibitions and Public Programs. Thank you for joining us this evening for the League's discussion lecture series. Our additional thanks to the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for making this series possible. In tonight's program, two League artists, Meredith Bergmann and Brenda Berkman, will present on their shared and historical project, unveiling Central Park's first monument to the lives of real women, the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument, sculpted by Meredith Bergmann. Welcome, Brenda and Meredith.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Allison. Hello.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Now, Brenda and Meredith will share the multifaceted story of working with the organization Monumental Women, as well as the arduous process that led to celebrating the reveal of the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument. Remember that tonight's program will conclude with a brief Q&A. Submit your questions as Facebook comments on this live stream while you watch. Before we begin, I have the pleasure of introducing you to our two speakers. Brenda Berkman has had many careers, including that of lawyer and one of FDNY's first female firefighters. Brenda now studies printmaking at the League, where she frequently collaborates with fellow League artists. Brenda's works have reached wide audiences, and several of her projects honor benchmark anniversaries of 9/11. Brenda is also Monumental Women's Vice President for Programs and spearheaded the August 26, 2020 unveiling of Central Park's Women's Rights Pioneers Monuments and the Talking Statues app for the monuments, all during the midst of the pandemic. Meredith Bergmann, who studied at the League in the early 1980s, works both on public monuments and on a private scale, exploring vital social issues of both history and today. In addition to tonight's topic, her public commission, the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument in Central Park, Meredith's works include the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston's Back Bay, and the Memorial to September 11th for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. She is currently completing the FDR Hope Memorial for Roosevelt Island, New York City. Without any further hesitation, Brenda and Meredith, once again, thank you for joining us this evening. And Brenda, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much to the Art Students League and to Allison, Anki, and Andrew, the team who helped put this program together tonight. And thanks also to all of you who have tuned in tonight for the presentation. So if you bear with me for 1 second, I'm going to share the screen. And for some reason, it won't let me share the screen. Andrew, you got to let me share the screen here, pal. Okay. Sorry. All right. So without belaboring my bio here, after I retired from 25 years of service in the FDNY, I still had plenty of things to do, and this slide gives you some flavor of some of the projects I continue to work on, mentoring younger women firefighters and girls, doing tours of the 9/11 Memorial, volunteering at various projects in Japan and the Gulf after natural disasters, doing things with the pandemic, also doing political activism and being the subject of a children's book. But I'd always yearned to do something creative. So without any background in training or art, I started drawing and making small prints. And I founded the Art Students League. There it was, hiding in plain sight. I was searching for art classes on my computer, and I decided to sign up for printmaking for 1 month in January of 2007. And 1 month, I was going to learn all the forms of printmaking. Well, you know, that's just ridiculous. But immediately, I found mentors and teachers who encouraged me. Many of them, the other students who were experienced and accomplished artists, and I owe a lot to them, and I really wanted to collaborate with them. So the first major collaborative art project that I organized at the League was in 2011, the 9/11 decade, it was called, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of 9/11. All of the artists involved had a connection to the League, and here you see a few of the names of some of the artists that were involved. I gave all the artists my stone lithograph self-portrait, my 9/11 self-portrait, to work on to express their feelings about 9/11. And after the group show was exhibited at Westbeth, the League collected the whole series. My next major printmaking project at the League was to create 36 views of One World Trade Center beginning in 2013. My intention was to follow in the tradition of printmaking series like those done by Hokusai, Hiroshige, and Revere, and to document the rebuilding of One World Trade Center, a process of rebuilding that I was constantly watching as I did my volunteer tours of the 9/11 memorial at the World Trade Center. After 3 years of drawing and printing off lithostones, the series was complete, and it's been acquired by the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, as well as other institutional and private collectors. So here's some of the examples. The series shows the building of the Trade Center from the very bottom of the pit as it rose, and the trees were planted from all the different viewpoints of the 5 boroughs and also New Jersey, and has all kinds of iconic themes to it that you would see, people would see normally just looking at the World Trade Center from around New York City. It also incorporates many references to the previous series of prints that I mentioned. So now I continue to create prints, some with political themes. And at the same time that I was doing all this, because of my background in history and activism, I was asked to join the board of the organization Monumental Women. Monumental Women's first project had just begun, the attempt to put the first statue of real women into Central Park. What does it say about New York City? That as of 2014, when Monumental Women began, there were only 5 public statues out of over 100 public statues in the city that honored real women. Only 5 out of over 100 in the entire city. And there were 0 statues of real women in Central Park, although there were 23 statues of historical men in the park. Monumental Women vowed to change that. There were many challenges to putting a monument to real women in Central Park. There had not been a new statue in Central Park in 60 years. And as I said, never a statue of real women. We kept being asked, why don't you want to put a garden honoring women in Central Park? And we persisted and said, no, we want to put a statue in the park. Excuse me. Even after Parks Commissioner Mitchell Silver agreed with Monumental Women that it was time that there should be a statue honoring real women in Central Park, others at the Parks Department and the Central Park Conservancy, who jointly manage the park, raised repeated objections, which Meredith will explain in greater detail. We had to find a site. Initially, they were going to put us on the outside of the park, but then we convinced them that, in fact, there was the perfect site right there in the center of the park, on the mall, on Literary Walk, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And we were told, you've got to raise all the private funding to sponsor this statue, over 1.5 million. And you have to deal with all the numerous and often conflicting city agencies that have jurisdiction over the putting of any monument in public space. We had to redesign the monument to meet numerous and often conflicting opinions about history and aesthetics. We were often challenged by the lack of knowledge, not only by by city agencies, but by the public. about women's history. And we were dealing with a fixed date for the unveiling of the monument on August 26th. Why August 26th? Because it was the 100th anniversary of the enactment of the 19th Amendment. And as we're going along, in March, of course, I don't need to tell anybody this, the pandemic hits and everything shuts down. The park shuts down, the foundry shuts down, and you may also recall that all of the restrictions around public events, such as an unveiling, were constantly changing. Here are the key objectives that we had that we persisted in despite all these barriers. One was to pay tribute to these three women, Truth, Stanton, and Anthony, these women's rights pioneers. And in doing so, we would break the bronze ceiling and we would create the first statue of real women in Central Park's 167-year history. We would dedicate that monument on the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage, August 26, 2020, on that mall in New York Central Park, which 42 million people typically visit each year. In doing so, we would also create an ongoing educational campaign about women's rights to be shared in New York City and across the country. And we would inspire people to reimagine public spaces to include tributes to women and people of color who made our city, New York City, and other cities around the country great. How did we, what was the $1.85 million that was only for phase one of our budget? What did that go for? It went for the creation, construction, and maintenance of the monument. It goes for the site preparation and the landscaping. It went for educational programming and media, the unveiling ceremony and related activities, and then developing these best practices and toolkits. The statue is located at the northwest corner of Literary Walk, which is on the mall in the heart of Central Park. If you walk into Central Park, you know where the mall is because it's the widest pedestrian path and it extends that quarter of a mile from the south end of the roadway to the Bethesda Fountain. And that site that we were privileged to get conforms to the dictates of the Central Park designers, Olmsted and Vaugh, which identified only 2 locations where commemorative sculpture should be sited in Central Park: the mall, where we ended up, and the entrances to the park's perimeter. Here's a map of where exactly it is. You notice on the right is Fitzgreen Halleck, which was in his day was a very famous poet and writer. And then we're just up the street from Robbie Burns and Sir Walter Scott. Unlike the men who were honored with statues in Central Park, the city insisted that monumental women had to prove the connection of the 3 women, Truth, Stanton, and Anthony, to New York City and to Central Park. So here it is. These are the connections that all 3 women had to New York City. And, you know, I could go into greater detail about this, but we're short on time. And here's the image of the model of the beautiful monument that Meredith Bergmann designed, and which she will explain in detail in her presentation. But I also want to mention that our monument has a special thing. It's the Talking Statues app, which has the added feature of an app that helps educate the public about the women portrayed and the sculptor Meredith through this app. This is to provide much more background and education about the monument than you could possibly get from standing there staring at, you know, the bronze and marble. So, I'm sorry, bronze and granite. So when you visit, I would urge you to take your mobile phone and point it at the QR code that's on the sign by the monument, and that will activate the voices of Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. You can listen to it in English or in Spanish. The entire program has been translated into Spanish. And as you can see from the listing at the bottom of this slide, it's quite an impressive group of activists and actresses who volunteered their talents to voice these three women: Viola Davis for Truth and Jane Alexander for Anthony, Meryl Streep for Stanton in the English version, and the Spanish language narrators are Zoe Saldana for Truth, America Ferrara for Anthony, and Rita Moreno for Stanton. All was completed just in time for August 26th. And here we are unveiling the statue to a much reduced crowd, but like this Zoom, you know, thousands of people were watching this live online because we were streaming. And you can see that a very distinguished group of people were speakers there. Secretary Clinton, Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, and many others. Why did Monumental Women ultimately succeed in this difficult undertaking? This is my opinion. We had an all-volunteer board of directors with the necessary sets of skills and commitments and a very strong commitment to making this happen. We had a president of the board, Pam Elam, who has a deep knowledge of women's history, government experience, and she refused to quit whenever obstacles arose. We have supporters, both individuals and organizations, who contribute funds and other means of support. Very importantly, we had a sculptor, Meredith Bergmann, with vision, experience with public art challenges, a commitment to women's history, talent, and drive. We had fantastic support from our project managers, Bayer Blinder Bell. We had talented videographer, Emily Dumbroff, and other media support from Anat Gerstein. We had a lot of luck. I mean, we were so lucky that the Foundry was allowed to reopen in time, and because they prioritized the project to meet the unveiling deadline. And then we had several of us who went without sleep for a month. So what's next for Monumental Women? Well, we need your support to help us accomplish things like our History and Art Project for Kids, Put Her on a Pedestal, which you can learn more about on our website. We need your help to help us establish a 5-borough women's rights history trail, which will honor a mixture of well-known and lesser-known women's rights activists in all 5 boroughs who are diverse in backgrounds and generations. We are proud to announce that this month we will be issuing our toolkit, which will help other groups to honor more women and people of color in their public spaces. So when that comes out, we'd ask your help in making that known widely throughout the country. And so I just want to conclude by quoting Susan B. Anthony. There have been others also just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name every one, but with such women, and in our case men, consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. So here's our contact information. And now I thank you so much for your attention, and I hand the program off to the sculptor of the Central Park Women's Rights Pioneers Monument, the accomplished League alum, Meredith Bergmann.
Thank you, Brenda. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Well, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you tonight. I never miss an opportunity to show off our seal. When we were in our 20s, my husband, with some embarrassment, admitted that he had always wanted a seal. So I drew one for him. And our motto is to move, to teach, or to delight. And you can see that the seal has calmed the waters so that the candle can remain lit. Putting some kind of a twist on a commission is essential for me as a way of working on more than one level at a time and working for myself as well. My most recent commission, the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument, was unveiled in August on the anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Votes for Women Amendment to the US Constitution. And this was commissioned by an all-volunteer, not-for-profit organization, Monumental Women, as a gift to New York City. When they were organized, their first step was to get people to notice that in Central Park, there were 23 statues of men and none of real women. And what did that say about the invisibility of women and the perceived value of their achievements from history and still today? Monumental Women struggled for years, 6 years, to get a site in the center of the park. And here is Literary Walk with the paired statues of two Scottish authors, Robbie Burns, Sir Walter Scott. And just to the north of them is Fitzgreen Halleck, who nobody reads today, but he was a popular satiric poet. And when his statue was unveiled in 1876, there were 10,000 people at his unveiling, including the President of the United States. And across from him for 150 years was nothing. The statues of the male writers show them deep in thought, as if waiting for inspiration. My commission was to make statues of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and to find some way to honor the many other diverse women who participated in the struggle for women's rights and continue to participate without actually portraying them. There were issues of size and scale. The monument had to harmonize with the park's existing historic collection, so we could only have 2 statues. The 70-year moratorium on new monuments in the park had never before been lifted for a new monument, so we were going to break the bronze ceiling. But the issue was how to celebrate this 100th anniversary and also show that the struggle for universal suffrage and women's rights is ongoing, that the work is unfinished. I decided to show the women at work, writing together on Literary Walk. I wanted to portray them at the most intense period of their collaboration when they were younger. But as a sculptor, I particularly liked this pose with Anthony standing and Stanton seated, both focused on one document. Now, they were very different and very complementary people. Anthony never married. Stanton had a long, difficult marriage and 7 children. And Anthony struggled to write her speeches and often came to Stanton for help. Stanton wrote volumes of fairly radical prose, but only began to emulate Anthony's far-flung activism after she stopped having children. I won the competition with this maquette because it captured some of the spirit of that collaboration that brought about the 19th Amendment. I included 20 other women by means of a scroll bearing powerful quotations in chronological order from 1848, the date of the first Women's Rights Convention in America, to 1920 and the 19th Amendment, landing on a ballot box right up next to the fence that separates the statues from the mall, with the 19th Amendment quoted last. So it didn't merely name the women, but it carried the urgency of their voices, and it formed a chronological history of the movement. The traditional figurative design of this monument is supposed to suggest the monument that should have been erected back in the 19th century. But the scroll, which is a more abstract contemporary form, was designed to burst off the traditional pedestal and refuse to know its place, like these women, and land right by the fence. And I wanted a 21st century digital kiosk on our side of the fence near the monument to continue the scroll's chronology and link to more content and allow for updates and comments on the unfinished struggle for women's rights. I redesigned the pedestal and the scroll many times. I think this is scroll version number 9. It was important that the quotations all be legible. I'm a poet too, and I was interested in the ancient paragone or rivalry between the written word and visual arts, particularly statuary, which was more enduring, which was more powerful. And I wanted people to stand there and actually read the scroll and learn the history and hear those historic voices in the presence of these mute statues. Now, because of my strict deadline to unveil on August 26, 2020, and still allow 7 months for bronze casting and before that for mold making, I began working on a 1/3 height model. It's what you see behind me here, finished. And I had, at that time, a year to win design approval from the city and then complete the full-size clay enlargement. And when I say I mean Monumental women and helpers from many, many city agencies supporting the project. Here are the finished 1/3 height figures. Anthony is 3 feet tall and ready for enlargement to 9 feet tall. But after months of discussion, basically a year of discussion, the Public Design Commission of New York City gave us unanimous approval only if we removed the scroll, the ballot box, and any reference to the suffrage movement or abolitionism or any of the work these women did. That would leave just their names and these 2 statues, no historical context, no mention of what these women accomplished for us, and no record of the movement's diversity. And that was not acceptable to Monumental women or to me. And we eventually won the right to add a 3rd statue on the pedestal, Sojourner Truth, and the inscription, Women's Rights Pioneers. Sojourner Truth, famous as a speaker for abolition and women's rights, was a contemporary of Stanton and Anthony. These women shared stages and wrote to each other, and Truth was an overnight guest in Stanton's house. Here, Truth wears a brocade jacket and a silk shawl, and I rendered the stripes in the jacket as strips of embroidered laurel wreaths. That's the traditional crown given to great orators. Truth was one of the first people, to copyright and sell her own image, which was a radical form of self-ownership for someone formerly enslaved. She often had herself photographed with her knitting, which was not a hobby. It was considered a valuable skill and a signifier of patriotism and status. Meanwhile, because of the deadline, I began to work at full size. And you can see the statues are done in such a way that I could remove the heads and the hands and work on them on a table. Here's a studio view from June 2019. Stanton's digital foam enlargement has just been delivered. That's to the right, and there's no clay on it. At the left is the 1/3 height model with a skeletal armature for Sojourner Truth. Now, all the arms, wrists, necks, and even 3 of the legs on these enlargements would be cut and moved and shifted to improve the overall composition. And this enlargement process had to be completed within 5 months to leave time for molding and casting. So here in mid-July 2019 is the finished 1/3 height model, the thing that's behind me. You'll see when I come back on screen with all figures, 3 figures. In order to make it a collaboration, a conversation, I swung the axis between Stanton and Anthony towards the back, making room for the 3rd figure of Sojourner Truth. I turned Stanton's head to engage with Truth. I moved what had been Stanton's writing desk to the center and made it a flat round table, a symbol of equality and engagement. And I moved Anthony's bursting traveling bag around to the left side. Now, in order to represent the entire women's rights movement, these 3 figures had to serve as portraits and at the same time as symbols, as an allegory. And they represent 3 different types of activism: speaking, organizing, and writing. And we won design approval in mid-October 2019. My deadline for finishing the enlargements was the end of November. So here I am with my assistant, Patrick Pigott, who's a monumental sculptor in his own right, and we're putting on the finishing touches. And here's the full-scale model in my studio with the 1/3 height model on November 24th. Okay, so to go quickly through the casting process. Next, the statues are destroyed. Here, this is mold making. And the statues are cut apart. Liquid rubber is poured on, painted on, and when that has cured, a rigid plaster shell is made. And that's what goes to the bronze foundry, the molds, where melted wax is painted and poured into them up to the thickness of the final bronze, about 1/4 inch, to create positive versions of each section. And then I go and work on them, and I always leave detailed work to be done. So there's pieces, parts of Sojourner Truth's face that have been added in wax, subtracted, scored, creased, everything. The bronze is cast in sections and welded together crudely, and then I go and approve those welds so that the statues actually touch each other where they're supposed to. And this hand of Anthony's that rests on Stanton's shoulder was a real problem, because in the original design, it was part of their reading together. Here, it's more as if she's either trying to quiet Elizabeth down or urge her forward to say something. And I love that ambiguity, but the hand had to rest on the shoulder in exactly the right place. That took about 3 hours. Here is the patina process where the bronze is heated, pigments and chemicals are painted on the hot metal that fuse with it and even out the color. This is the last day in the foundry. Now they had shut down, but they started up again and they went overtime. So the lady with the pink ponytail is their master patina artist, Rosemary Rednor, and she is still working on the patina on Sojourner Truth. Stanton to the right is finished and has a coat of hot wax. So she's brighter and darker, but more gleaming. And on the left, those two gentlemen are sealing up the underside of the chairs. And I will not tell you that story, but we didn't want raccoons climbing up inside the sculptures. And then it was delivered. All 7,000 pounds of bronze as one unit went on a truck to Central Park and installed. And it was unveiled. And I'm going to show you some of the details that invite curiosity and help tell the story. Susan Anthony is wearing a cameo of Minerva, the helmeted goddess of wisdom and strategy, because she was the organizer, and carried a very famous alligator traveling bag that Stanton said was stuffed with facts. So here I stuffed it with flyers for a women's rights convention at Cooper Union, a free lecture by Sojourner Truth, a petition for universal suffrage, and a piece of legislation proposed for the, legislation for the New York State legislature. Stanton is wearing a sunflower brooch, and the design on her dress those are little radiant sunflowers. In the earlier photo I showed, she was wearing a dress printed with chains, which I thought was very provocative. And I asked her great-great-granddaughter, Colleen Jenkins, who's a board member, why was she wearing chains? And Colleen said, oh, she was always messaging. So here she is messaging. Sunflowers were a symbol of the suffrage movement. They became a symbol, but sunflower was the pseudonym that Stanton chose as a girl when she first began to write and publish letters to the editor and then invited articles, because her family would have been so shocked and would have forbid her speaking out in public at that time. The books under Stanton's chair are by feminist foremothers, Mary Wollstonecraft, Sarah Grimke, and Margaret Fuller. And Sojourner Truth, people often ask me about this. The statue is not broken. She did have a missing finger, and her body became a symbol too, and she used it to bear witness against the violence of slavery. She lost part of her finger in a farm work accident, and it became part of the story of her escape from slavery because her master claimed that it slowed down her work, and they had agreed upon a term after which she would be free before the official partial emancipation by New York State. So she finished all the work she had committed to with him and took her youngest child and left. And here is her knitting. And And the three women are at work. I'm very happy with the final design. I love the way this interior negative space between and among the women, among their gestures, is charged with their energy. Sojourner Truth is gesturing with both hands for emphasis. Elizabeth Stanton is about to dip her pen and write, but is she taking down what Truth is saying, or has she just been interrupted in mid-thought? And Anthony is handing a document to Stanton. Has she just read it out loud, as friends and collaborators did for Sojourner Truth? I don't have the answers to this. I like the work of these three women. My desire is to provoke thought, to raise questions. It's important that the composition suggests that real change comes from collective work rather than individual heroism, one man on one pedestal, and that the work is unfinished, ongoing, and that right now somewhere, women somewhere in the world are sitting down together at a table to try to change the world. A monument must function, and it must be of use or it becomes invisible. 3 weeks after the unveiling, the public began to use the memorial to mourn for and praise the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this made me very happy because the monument had begun to work. And just before the presidential election, I learned a lot about this, starting in 1998 when I won the commission for the Boston Women's Memorial, up until 2003 when it was unveiled. And during those 5 years, I dealt with many of the same issues and themes as in Central Park. Here in Boston, I was able to take advantage of the humor and irony of contemporary art, as well as the traditional vocabulary of the other monuments along Commonwealth Avenue, all larger than life bronze statues with granite pedestals, inscribed quotations, to show these women having come down off their pedestals, making a core feminist idea concrete. Again, I wondered how these particular figures of Lucy Stone, Abigail Adams, and Phyllis Wheatley could honor all women. So I made the statues serve two purposes: portraits, and also made them 3 different ages with 3 different creative temperaments: action, contemplation, and imagination. These women never met, and I didn't want to portray them together as a group, but the monument is designed so that you can create the conversation that they could never have had. Bringing the 3 figures together in a conversational group was a challenge that I was very excited about in Central Park. And the sculptures in Boston are physically accessible, used, and loved. After the 2016 election, people left notes of apology in Lucy Stone's hand and put their "I voted" stickers on Abigail Adams. I'd like to show you where I got started. This 6-inch high bronze is from my 1977 student exhibition at Cooper Union, where I cast my first bronzes and got completely hooked on sculpture after studying graphic design, photography, calligraphy, and conceptual art, which was in its heyday then. You can see I was already dealing with a female figure, chair, objects, implied motion. I remember asking my sculpture professor, saying that I felt I needed to study anatomy. And he said, "Oh, you don't need to learn anatomy." So this was the 1970s. After traveling in Europe and studying in Italy, I came home and started taking classes at the League. Anatomy with Robert Beverly Hale, sculpture with Jose de Kreft and Sidney Simon, and drawing with Marshall Glazier. I worked a lot in bas-relief because I could grow the sculpture out of a drawing and compose in 2 dimensions, which was something I already felt comfortable doing. This 13-inch high bronze from 1980, The End of Patience, it's called, came directly from my experience in Sidney Simon's class. I sculpted the elderly life model and called her Patience. She was a regular at the League, and I had never seen a naked woman in her 70s. So I added an angel coming to finally cover up her nudity with a blanket. Patience sits on her suitcase, ready for a final journey. My stone carvings were influenced by de Kreft's simple, massive forms like this 20-inch high alabaster man with a shell. My first monuments were to imaginary figures. This is my monument to Anonymous from 1984, which I modeled and carved directly in cement. because I wanted to make large outdoor pieces, couldn't afford bronze. Anonymous is about 3 feet tall, and it was actually exhibited in Central Park for several months in a show of animal sculptures in 1989. My first large allegorical sculpture, The Little Soldier, was a monument to ordinary bravery, the kind you need to go to the dentist, in the form of an 8-foot-high walking molar crowned with gold leaf. I arranged this with the New York City Parks Department all on my own to site it temporarily in a park in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, near my studio. There was, unfortunately, no program yet like the League's really marvelous Model to Monument program. After 2 or 3 weeks, the sculpture was severely vandalized and had to be removed. I repaired it and sold it to a dental supply company in Pennsylvania. And then I began applying for public art commissions in earnest, thinking that the people who commissioned my sculpture would know in advance that they wanted it, would take ownership and protect it and put it to use. And of course, those commissions were mainly figurative. My first historical monument was this memorial to County Cullen, a poet of the Harlem Renaissance. I was already combining the imaginary and the allegorical and the real. This is a poet contemplating his own bust, his own life's history, and his youthful fame. When I researched Cullen, I was struck by his really strong curiosity, almost an obsession, about whether his obituaries would describe him as a poet or a Black poet. He clearly would have preferred the former. Cullen died in middle age at 43. I read his obituaries and decided to render the question and not the answer. I make art that, without being simplistic, can be appreciated by anyone, that somehow subverts the conventions within which it operates, and that reflects the struggle for social justice. I've built my career outside the art world and its focus on commodification and celebrity. At the Art Students League, I found a way to study exactly what I needed to learn at the time, and I am very grateful. And here are New Yorkers taking in the monument, absorbing the narrative, and hopefully the more abstract qualities of the sculpture as well. For instance, I love the way Anthony's skirt, which is in motion because she's just come in from organizing, set down her bag, the way her skirt echoes the root flare of this historic elm tree nearby. I hope there will soon be many more statues commemorating women's achievements in New York City and beyond. Thank you for listening, and Allison, back to you.
Right.
Okay.
Well, goodness, thank you so much, Meredith and Brenda. Really exciting to hear this story come to life through both of you. So thank you so much again for joining us. We do have some time remaining in tonight's program for a Q&A. Our watching audience has been entering their questions as Facebook comments. So as the Q&A begins, those of you still tuning in, please feel free to keep pouring those questions in. Just write a Facebook comment with your question. We will get to as many as we can in the 15 minutes or so that we have remaining. To begin us off, one of our watchers, Winnie, asks, do you think the original opposition that you faced in commissioning this work would have been the same if you had been a male sculptor with a sculpture of a male? So,
Meredith, I'll let you answer that, Meredith.
Surely you both can speak to this.
I don't think the opposition would have been the same, but I'm sure there would have been opposition because there is no public art project without it. I mean, the public is many, many voices. So the specific issues of wanting something more polite and diminutive and feminine, like a garden to begin with, probably wouldn't have come up. But depending on who the monument was to and who it depicted and how, yeah, there would have been opposition.
But nobody in New York has a strong opinion about anything, right? So we just assumed it was going to be a breeze. And I'm, of course, joking in the extreme. But we were fortunate in having people on our board and as in our support network, Gail Brewer was a tremendous support to us and helping us shepherd this through the approval process. We got unanimous approval from the 11 community boards that surround the park. We had to go to each community board and present to them, and we got unanimous approval. So there has always been a lot of support for this happening. And I think, you know, I very much agree with Meredith that, you know, the public has come to already embrace this monument. What happened with RBG and then on election day, and the comments that we get from people who have walked by and stopped, and they're showing their children and they're using the app. I mean, this is great.
Yeah.
We're very, very happy with the final design.
Definitely. It's interesting to see it becoming living history so quickly as we just see, you know, I mean, the additional news items that we're hearing about. Sorry, just reading some additional questions that we have pouring in. I have a related question to Winnie's. Tracy asks, what was the reason given for not being able to include historical contributions of women? Was that a rationale that you sort of heard? Was it at all convincing?
You mean, why were there no existing monuments to women?
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I know that, you know, prior to this being the first monument to real women, we do see sculptures in Central Park dedicated to fictional women. So I'm curious whether that became a part of the conversation as well early on.
Well, there's the Frances Hogston Burnett monument that honors the author of The Secret Garden, but it doesn't show her portrait. So there were no physical representational portraits of women. No one came up with a reason. I think, again, it's because women's achievements were not considered worthy, and women were not supposed to go out in public and achieve things at the beginning of the 19th century. So the park is a historical collection. It's not meant to be up to the last minute. Something like that wonderful exhibition of the gates, Christo's gates, after 9/11, was a beautiful thing, and it was temporary. And when I was in the exhibition with Anonymous of animal sculptures, that was temporary. But the park is a piece of kind of living history, so they were very reluctant to add to it.
Absolutely.
You know, the additional question is, why are there only, now there's 7 because they just added a statue of RBG out in Brooklyn, but why is it that there are 7 statues of real women in the entirety of New York City? And this is not unique to New York. This is all over the country. So that's why we're very excited to be able to offer help to other groups that want to honor women and people of color in their public spaces. Obviously, there has been a lot of discussion about this issue throughout the country, and you know, it can be a very daunting task to try and raise all this money to achieve all the government approvals, and we learned a lot in the process. We think we came up with some good solutions to some of the questions. And so we're happy to provide this toolkit to other groups to help them along with their journeys. Absolutely.
And Brenda, when you say that there are 7 monuments to real women throughout New York City.
Statues.
Statues, I see.
Yes.
So does that number include the statues that we're seeing of allegorical women, for example, the female form representing justice, truth, these things we see? I see. Yeah.
No, there are dozens of those.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
zillions of fake women.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious, are either of you able to speak to that? We have so many of these, you know, women sort of standing in for concepts. And it seems to me, just from an observer's perspective, that we're seeing a really kind of narrow pinhole of like idealizing the female form. Meredith, is that something that you are reframing as you make monuments to real women?
Well, sure. I think about this all the time, and I'm fascinated with the whole history of allegory, of representing the state as a woman, liberty as a woman, boats and hurricanes being female, all of this, and how the female was perceived and then rendered in public and in the mind of the state, really, and of the church. But I think all that has changed so profoundly with the liberation of women that the art will follow. And I love getting in there and playing with those concepts. So
I would
it's a
say
very
that,
rich
I would
history.
say the art is following very slowly. And that, you know, we still have these visions in our head of what is the proper role of women in our society that are very constricting. And these women that are portrayed at on this monument, I think Ken Burns said it best at our unveiling ceremony, where he said, these are national heroes. They started a movement along with others, many others, women from all over the country of very diverse backgrounds. They started a movement that resulted in the enfranchisement of 50% of the population. Now there's, you know, a movement though that unfortunately we are still fighting every day, you know, that to make it possible to have universal suffrage. That's what all three of these women were arguing for. They would be perfectly at home with Stacey Abrams and other people who are trying to, you know, make it possible for participatory democracy. And so this is in my, you know, in Monumental Women's opinion, the perfect time to have these inspirational women available to the 42 million, hopefully we'll get back up to that very soon, that walk into Central Park every year.
Yeah,
Absolutely, the time is now. I'd like to transition us into a series of questions about the formal elements of the sculpture and your process in particular, Meredith. My first question from our audience, could you talk a little bit about the process of aging with monuments when a new sculptural piece is joining these pieces that, as you say, have been here since the 19th century? Is that something that you notice? You spoke briefly about the patina and creating a surface that matches the aesthetic of the existing sculptures.
that was actually quite an issue because the park does periodic restoration of the monuments, and the last restoration left most of those statues a very dark color, which I don't like. I like a lighter patina, brighter, because it will darken by itself. But they were okay with this having a different patina, which was great. But initially the site that was suggested appeared to be just a notch further north at the exact corner where the two paths met. And I wanted to do a piece that occupied that corner, that was on the diagonal, and that really didn't know its place, because that again would add to the metaphor, the symbolism of the piece. And basically the Central Parks Conservancy said there should be a tree there. And there is this living architecture of the mall with these historic elm trees, which they're really fighting to preserve against disease. That's why you can't walk in there. There are fences. But they create the aisle of a cathedral almost. And then the statues are in niches as they would be in a cathedral. So we had to conform to that, which worked out all right, but it is more traditional.
Are you able to share the name of the foundry that you worked with?
Oh, yes, sure. It's UAP Talix. I've been working with them for decades. They used to be called Polish. I think it might be UAP Polish Talix, and we call them Talix. They're upstate a bit in Rock Tavern, New York. Wonderful foundry.
Just outside of the city, and the zone that would have kept them from reopening.
That's right.
If they had been a little bit further south. I mean, there were so many decisions that were made in the process of creating this that looking back, it was just complete luck that we ended up being able to actually get this done in time for the 100th anniversary. I mean, clearly the goddess was smiling upon us on this one, because there were many different paths we could have gone down that would have, I believe, totally prevented us from meeting that deadline.
Yeah, and the stone yard in Vermont, where the granite comes from in Barry, Vermont, was able to reopen fairly promptly. But we built as much time as we could into this. This is not the first commission I've done. And I work with my husband as project manager. He's an independent filmmaker, and he knows how to juggle time, money, people, and disasters. So it came out okay.
Great.
Well, great, thank you. We have time for just one more question before we wrap things up. So I'm going to ask another audience question, one we often invite our speakers to reflect on us with, which is knowing that you've both been driven by change making in your practices, both artistically and in your careers. What advice could you give to artists tuning in who are similarly hoping to make a difference with their work?
Brenda,
I'll go first. So, you know, you're not put on earth to take up space. And my belief about art is that you use it as a way of talking about things that are important to you. And if, you know, and so things that are trivial, why would you bother, really? I mean, of course, you have to learn how to do things, you know, sculpt and paint and whatever, but it comes down to being brave, to making decisions about what you put in your art that may not be the most popular thing at the time, but that are the true expression of your ideas about things, and hopefully move social justice down the field. That's definitely something that I try and do with my art.
I think the only thing I could add to that, which is very eloquent, is that whatever you are most passionate about is your key to the most vivid expression. And you need to follow that and develop it and commit to it. But I would also say that art, the long, deep history of art is of service, service to the state, service to religion, not always for justice and not always for kindness or equality, but it can be now. And art can be a very powerful way to provoke and challenge, but also to comfort and unite. And that's up to you. You can go either direction, or both, but it kind of behooves you as artists to develop your talents towards some goal of increasing justice and recognition of life on earth.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to end on. So to officially wrap up this program for the evening, thank you once again, Meredith and Brenda, for lending your time this evening and for this really incredible story and all the insight that you're providing to us based on this conversation we've been lucky enough to have towards the end. So thank you.
Everyone go and visit the monument.
Please, yes.
Yes.
That is something you can safely see.
Spring is coming.
Take pictures of yourselves and send them to Monumental Women. Maybe we'll put them up.
Perfect. And speaking of Monumental Women, the organization that helped to make this sculpture possible, be sure to visit Monumental Women's website. It is monumentalwomen.org. And there you can learn more and support their work to educate about women's history and honor more women and people of color in public spaces. Please also follow them on Facebook and Instagram at Monumental Women NYC and Twitter at Monumental Women. Additionally, you can view more of Meredith and Brenda's incredible works on their respective websites, Brenda can be found at brendaberkmanartworks.com, and Meredith can be found at meredithbergman.com. Links to both of these artists' websites are also in the program description for this evening. Thank you as well to those of you who tuned in and for our participating audience for your thoughtful questions. We will keep these conversations going, not only during March, Women's History Month, but also beyond. We will be uploading a recording of tonight's program onto our YouTube channel. So subscribe to the Art Students League of New York on YouTube and follow us on Instagram at ASLNYC. Lastly, this coming Tuesday at 6 p.m., join us for a live conversation between curator Anki King and two artist and league instructors, Ellen Eagle and Jerry Weiss. This talk will surround the current exhibition on view at the Art Students League, Faces of the League, which is portraits from our permanent collection. For more information on this program and our future programs, see the event listings on our website, theartstudentsleague.org. Once again, Brenda and Meredith, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And to those of you turning in, as always, stay healthy.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Allison.
Thanks, Allison, and everyone.
Yes, thank you. Good night.
Good night.